Brewster, you've written a number of books about agriculture, including Invisible Giant, and a book coming out, I hear it's called Farmageddon.
Farmageddon.
And what brought you to literature about agriculture?
Oh, well, it goes back a long way of concern about, I started out with economics of development, and I said, well, development's not such a good thing. I got to looking at that more and more, and working in poverty issues, social justice, peace activist, whatnot over the years. But then I got interested in looking at how we actually, trying to look at how people, how we organize our lives, and saying, if we want to know what do we really believe in, let's look at how we organize our lives. And I got to looking at food at that point, saying, let's take something like a simple commodity and see how we relate to the world through what we eat. And then we farmed for 15 years. For a change of pace, and since then, the last 15 years, I've been writing and doing a lot of lecturing, and it just seems to me that the food system is a way of focusing on the fundamental issues of our society in a way that people can relate to, and it was kind of a vacuum in terms of, particularly when I started looking at the corporate sector. In the 70s, there was a lot of writing on agribusiness and so on. And with Dan Morgan's book in 1979, there was nothing after that. And I thought, this is very strange. How come all of a sudden the corporations have become invisible? So I said, I think we need to focus on that and point out that the corporations didn't go away, they just hid. And they appeared under a lot of names, but basically the government started getting the flack for all the problems. And the corporations were just having a fine time making money and consolidating, and they've been on that path ever since. So I just, because of having farmed and seeing food as a way of getting at things and liking to eat and thinking that good food ought to be there for everybody, that's what I've ended up focusing on. And then inevitably got into biotechnology, because if one looks at corporate control of the food system, you say, well, what are the mechanisms from trade to buying and selling, the futures market and so on, and then you have to get into the concentration of in processing or in input like fertilizers, machinery, and now the whole emphasis on biotechnology is sort of the ultimate means of control for maximizing profits, and that's where we are.
When the consumer goes to the store and takes some packaged food off the shelf, brings it home and eats it, by and large that consumer does not know what has happened to that food prior to its arrival on the shelf. So, can we walk through the chain from the farm to the shelf, and talk a little bit about the money as well?
Well, it's getting to be an easier and easier proposition in one sense, because there's fewer and fewer players in the game. But I suppose it's not unreasonable to suggest now that the farmer is, well, I'd say most modern industrial farmers are very little different than the operator of a McDonald's franchise in a corner. They buy all their inputs from very limited sources that are basically increasingly the same people that they sell to. So the farmer is basically ends up either as you could say a franchisee, or I suppose I could say a serf, working for the Lord, who in this case is a multinational corporation. You can take something like Cargill and that will. Well, it sold the seed business by and large, most of it, but it was supplying the seed, it would supply the fertilizer, and then it would buy the crop and process it. But you never see Cargill at the retail end, because they, I think, cleverly figured that if people realized that an average meal, I did this once with looking at Christmas dinner, and you'd say, virtually everything could have been handled by Cargill. And if people really knew that, if it all had a label on it saying where it came from, people would get quite distressed. So Cargill and other companies don't put their own name on it. They may operate with a brand name, or they'll have a retailer that has their own name on it. But if you look back behind that, you'd see something quite different. So they, and now, and it's a little different in Canada than the U.S. It's kind of interesting, because in Canada, as far as the consumer goes, a major controlling element into determining the market and what's there and at what price is the wholesale retail end, where we have such a high degree of concentration that basically one company, Weston, which is known as Superstore, Loblaws, and a variety of things, they are so large that they basically can decide what food policy is going to be at the retail level. And the others pretty well have to play the game. So they're price setters. They set the standards and patterns of distribution and so on, which ought to worry a whole lot of people, because and if you go in the store, you say, well, look at this wonderful selection. And there appear to be a whole lot of names, and you could be very easily misled without realizing that you've got Safeway, and you've got, in the West, you've got Overweighty, and you've got Loblaws. There's three, that's all. And then you say, where are all the other stores? Well, they've all been swallowed up. But you look inside the store and you say, oh, but look, we still have all this choice. But if you then were to look behind the name of General Foods or Kraft or Unilever, or, you see a surprisingly limited number of addresses when you get down to reading the fine print on the label. Or even within a Loblaw, Weston Superstore, it might look like a lot of different companies are supplying, but if you look at the label, you'll see one address for just about everything, and that's their home headquarters. So what they're doing now is they're so big that they will tell a processor, we want so much of this, and we'll pay you this for it. And if the processor, and we'll give you a contract. So what was an independent processor becomes part of that of Weston's scheme of things, and after the first contract, the guy says, oh, that's great, and the company will then say, well, we'd like you to double that, because and we'll give you but we'll give you more volume, but we won't pay you quite the same price. Well, the guy says, oh, okay, this is great, I can do that. But by then he's gone out and borrowed, and the next time it comes around, Weston's might say, well, we found somebody else who's willing to supply us at this price. Can you meet it? And the poor guy says, God, he's taken on this huge debt to expand the business, and he's pretty well stuck. And then you realize, oh, he's exactly the same position as the poultry farmer is, or the hog farmer is, that's running the same kind of business, just in a different section, but who's controlling it? They're not running their own ship. And what they're supplying is just what those companies think that will sell well and make them the most money. With the result that the profits in the retail food sector are very handsome indeed, and in processing, if you're on the winning side. The problem is that there's fewer and fewer winners, and if we look around in British Columbia and say, where's all the small processors? They're gone. We don't process any food here. It's all been centralized. And the same thing's happening across the U.S. You have one bakery serving the entire country for a single company. It's amazing.
What kind of money are we talking here in terms of profit margins? Because we know that the small family farmer is not able to meet costs.
Yeah.
What do we know about the amount of money being paid to the small farmer as opposed to the amount of money taken in by a corporation such as Cargill?
Well, it's hard to put figures on something like Cargill because it's private, but if you take some of the other companies, they're looking at 15 to 20%. On a lot of them, it's surprising how many companies will say, well, our goal is 15% or 20% return on equity per annum. And you say, you want to make 20% on what you're taking in while the farmer is making virtually nothing, and the people down the scale, it is part of your game, they're squeaking by maybe, but that's a pretty handsome profit, if you're doing that. And if you figure that at that level, these stores are turning over the goods. If they're making 15% and they're turning things over, their cash flow is immense, and that's something we need to remember in terms of the kind of leverage they have. That it may not look, in one sense, they say, well, it's not that much, but if you realize what they control with that, that can be very substantial. And I think that's part of the issue in the whole food system is the question of control and how things get leveraged. So that a company doesn't have to own everything. It can be in a position, as with a company like Cargill, it doesn't tie its capital up because it wants to use its capital to leverage the commodities it buys in volume so that it can buy and sell freely. Does that very well. And what their return is anybody's guess. And of course, in any of these businesses, how, when you're of a certain size, you can manipulate where the profit is, and an awful lot of it can be hidden. But the upshot of it is they say some have toned it down lately, but 15 to 20%.
So how are they able to exercise this degree of manipulation over a very long trail from the store back to the farm? What gives them that amount of leverage? We've talked about large sums of money. We know how that works, but what's the politics involved here?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question in terms of the politics. In the U.S., it's a little bit different because they've used the things like foreign aid programs and school food programs and all kinds of things that have been of vast benefit. And this is a long history. I mean, most of the grain terminals in the U.S. are owned by the public and leased by private companies. Cargill was an expert at this. And that gives them kind of a leverage again in that they don't have their money tied up, they have use of the facilities. But then when it comes to a government aid program, they have their political friends, and they can say, well, we'll deliver for this much, and you give us so much. This is how, in the post-war World War II years, Cargill made an immense amount of money handling government relief programs and supplying them. So you get very good working relationships, and how those are smoothed along. I mean, that's a whole other question. A company like Archer Daniels Midland was very much more upfront in their political patronage and in their lobbying. I mean, they made a point that they could walk into any president's office and say, well, we think this would be good. So you see something like the ethanol subsidies, and that's Archer Daniels Midland's pet project, and so on at that end. But the other, in terms of how companies get their way, I think it's when you have enough agents, as it were, or you go to a town and you say you want to put up a mall and that'll wipe out all the small businesses, they get very clever at getting concessions out of playing off one location against another. And that doesn't matter whether it's a soybean processing plant or a mall for a supermarket. They say, well, we would like this kind of tax relief, and if you won't provide it, well, then we'll go over here. And they just bargain, and they kind of just like marionettes play with municipalities, or states do this, and provinces, and bid on who's going to exploit you, who's going to take advantage of your tax concessions. I mean, it's an absurd game that we've accepted, that this is the way business is run. But you have the same thing in the store. If I want to get my new brand of peanut butter on the shelf, I've got to pay a fee to the grocery store for selling my goods, and a very hefty fee, which basically excludes all small suppliers. Extremely difficult for anybody to get into a big store because they simply haven't got the cash to pay for the right to sell in somebody else's store. But that's to say, it's the same kind of way. So you use those kind of leverages to consolidate power and to keep other people out. And we're seeing it now all of a sudden in Canada, where a lot of the corner stores, the convenience stores, are going to be, there's one chain that's now national, and they intend to determine how everybody else does business, because they're big enough, and they've said quite bluntly, given the size we are now, we can say to our suppliers, this is what we'll pay you for this. Take it or leave it. And the small people can't compete with that. I mean, so they start dictating the terms, and they say, we will reduce our costs by 10% by being able to dictate the terms to our suppliers, which the small independents can't do. But once you get big enough, you can do that. And that 10% is not going to go to the consumer in terms of lower prices. It's going to go into their profits.
Again, as the consumer looks at the product on the shelf, the consumer, I believe, is operating under the assumption that that product came from the farmer. It was packaged, certainly, even minimally in bulk. But how does that product actually fall under the control of the Cargill Corporation to such a degree? What has blocked the farmer's ability to sell directly to the retailer, for example?
Well, if you look at the choice, I was talking with a guy who was growing broccoli, and it was harvest time, and He said, so, I mean, he pointed down the road and he said, here's a store down here that's my neighbor. And I went in and I said, look, I've got some beautiful broccoli. And the guy said, yeah, I'd love to buy it, but I can't. What do you mean you can't? Well, I'm locked into a buying agreement. I have a deal and I can only buy from this one supplier. Even though he knew all of his customers would much rather have the local broccoli that was grown down the road and that would benefit this community, he was locked into a situation where he couldn't do that. So the farmer, then what does the farmer do? Well, the farmer then has to sell to a wholesaler, and that gets consolidated, and somebody who's just said, well, I have a contract to deliver so much broccoli to this processing plant. So the consumer comes out saying, well, wait a minute, why am I getting, here Farmer John's broccoli has gone into the processing plant with a whole lot of other stuff, and I'm supposed to buy fresh stuff that's coming from California at this time of year when it's fresh right down the road. And the farmer's sitting there saying, I've got no choice. I can't do anything about it. When they've eliminated the processors, there's nobody for the farmer to sell to locally. The chains only, we've seen it in consolidation of the dairy. The dairies have consolidated. They say, well, we've been told by, in this case, Weston's, that if we can't supply every store in the country, they don't want us. So then they start to consolidate and expand so they can meet a national contract. Well, where does that leave the independent producer? Out in the cold completely. You play the game this way or you don't play it. So what we're seeing is people beginning to say, we're going to have to build a different kind of system. But the farmer's choice then, now they have to, the bigger the firm is, the more they want in one single quantity. And they want uniformity. So you have this push all the time for a bigger scale, which eliminates, then the farmer's got too much to sell in the local market. He can't sell 1,000 pigs a week to the local little abattoir because there aren't that many people to whom he's got to ship them out. And then now he's gotten himself locked into that same kind of process. So that the consumer can't buy local pork and the farmer can't sell it to him because they've gotten into this game. And that's, you could look at virtually any food that's on the shelf and say, where does it come from? And the companies, for their part, maximization of profits is their business. And this term global sourcing then comes into play, and they'll say, well, yeah, that's nice broccoli, Joe, and yeah, you've got enough, but the fact is we can get it cheaper from Mexico. So I'm sorry about that. We'll give you this much for it, or we get it over here. So that even the guy who's playing the game is now getting played off globally. And so our food is nothing, it's like our automobiles or our TVs. You look at where is it made? Well, this piece was made here, that piece was made there, and it was all stuck together over here. So you may call it an American car or something, but that doesn't tell you a whole lot about where it came from. And then we've got now the same thing with our food. And whether it's sourcing animal feed or whether it's sourcing oil seeds for oil, where they shop around the world, and then you have to see where they can get it to whatever meets the specifications at the lowest cost. And so we're now, the poor farmer at the bottom end is playing a global game willy-nilly over which they have virtually no control. It's take it or leave it proposition.
The land where the food is grown, of course, has value. We're not able to grow food in hothouses or under NASA-type conditions in large quantities, so the land is where it has to happen. Would it be fair to say that the corporations are engaging in concerted efforts to actually drive the small family farmer off that land and take it over?
I wouldn't put it quite that way because the corporation doesn't need to bother with that at this point. I think there was a phase when there was notions of corporations actually buying land, but we're much too smart for that now. So why should we tie our capital up? Land is one of the most difficult commodities to buy and sell in the sense you can't float it around like you can a futures contract on hogs or pork bellies or wheat contract. They want liquidity. They want movement. And on the other side, you've got farmers who are convinced that the only way that you can farm is if you own your own land. So they'll go into debt to buy the land, and they'll carry the mortgage, and the farmer will take advantage. And the company will say, "Thanks, sucker. You carry the overhead, and we'll take you to the cleaners." They know better, and this is why the question of things like land trusts come up and say, "Look, there's got to be a better way of holding farmland, so that we don't have get ourselves in that box of overcapitalizing and being stuck with something that then the farmer can be exploited. So at the other side of it, of course, the small farmers are disappearing, and the corporations say, no, we don't have anything. We have no reason to get rid of the small farmers. They just have no use to us. And when you've got the market, as I suggested, that's so structured that the small guy can't survive, the companies don't need to get rid of them. They just die voluntarily. They'll disappear. And then it consolidates, and that's fine for the company. They'd have to deal with one supplier for everything. And one farmer, or was one global farmer, that would be fine too.
We have farm subsidies that figure in here as well, so we have substantial profits at the top end on the part of Cargill and others, Weston. You have farmers who are being very poorly paid for the crops they're growing. They're producing them and selling them at below cost. And yet you have farm subsidies, so how does that work?
Well, I was talking with a green farmer from Saskatchewan a couple of days ago, and he was talking about this whole business. The provincial governments did a big push to get Canadian farmers to expand in hogs. And it was all a dream. I mean, they said, well, who's going to eat all this pork? But what came along, what was invested in were these investor groups that would put up the money for a hog barn and maybe buy the hogs and then hire one farmer out of 10 to actually look after them. And now when the prices of pork drops, the bottom drops out of pork price, it didn't drop out, it was pushed out. It didn't just happen. I mean, the language is interesting. They say, well, the prices dropped. No, the prices didn't drop. The prices were lowered deliberately. But where the aid goes, then it doesn't really matter where it is. It's the big farmers who traditionally, historically, managed to capture most of that because they're in a position with the accountants and so on and their friends in the banks to say, well, okay, they've invested and they've got the political clout to say, we'll get the subsidies. And they deliberately can structure it to say that it's people with a certain size that we want to maintain. I've forgotten what the figures are with hogs. And if you're below that level, you're not viable anyway, so we're not going to subsidize you. So the subsidies automatically go to the bigger guys so that they can continue to sell at a loss and ride it out, while the poor guys, the guys at the bottom, haven't got that kind of cushion and they get squeezed out. And that's what we're seeing in hogs right now. But it goes through one commodity after another. I mean, it's just sort of like, oh, here's a mess, we'll clean this one up and collect some subsidies, and then we'll restructure over here. And there's I think, a tremendous amount of manipulation behind the scenes in terms of making the whole system more efficient for corporate profits.
The term money laundering was applied to this whole arrangement yesterday by a BC farmer. And I don't quite understand how that works with this subsidy situation and then, of course, the government money you talked about earlier in post-war programs dovetail.
Well, I mean, you have to look at where it's ended up. If the farmers are going broke and you've got corporations making 15%, there's obviously a transfer of funds going on. But it looks much better from the public standpoint if the subsidies are being paid to the farmers. And people don't say, wait a minute, what do you mean by farmer? 6 urban gentlemen who've invested in a hog farm are not farmers. But as owners of the hog farm, they qualify as farmers for most of these programs. So they collect the thing, even though they have nothing to do with farming, other than it's their money that's in there, and that's it. But you could put it much more simply in terms of the farmer at the bottom who's gotten involved in this industrial system and has to buy fertilizer, agrotoxins, machinery, and so on, and so he's responsible for that. He spends a great deal of money on inputs and then has to sell, and you say, well, the money's flowing through the farm, but what stays there? And we used to, when we were sheep farming, our farm gross was probably 10% of most hog farms of a comparable size. But our net was considerably higher because we weren't buying in, we were self-sufficient. So we weren't laundering money. What came in was a reward for our labor in the return, and we had a viable farm. It didn't look as good to the bankers and the lenders because we were small and self-sufficient, basically. and it made a huge difference. So we weren't, so how much money went through our hands, that was a totally different question than what we had to live on.
And in those terms, we've seen a lot of small farmers here at this organic conference who are attempting to change this marketplace. And in order to do that, it seems that they would have to stay away from marketing systems which would involve these large corporations. So how is that going to play out?
I think that it's interesting, and I think literally around the world, people have realized that the situation has been polarized to the point where these corporations have gained so much power and so much control and so extensively that anybody dealing with the food system anywhere, whether it's the individual that goes into the supermarket or the farmer, has to make a basic decision. Am I going to play that game over which I have no control and take whatever they offer and whatever terms and be satisfied with that? Or I say, I don't like that concentration of wealth. I don't like that concentration of power. I don't think what's happening is good. Therefore, I'm going to have to make a choice for myself about where I buy my food, what I eat, or for the farmer, what scale I'm going to operate and how I'm going to operate. And if I'm going to survive with integrity, then I'm going to have a totally different system. And that's where organics comes into play, is people saying, okay, the public saying, I don't like what's happening to me at this end of the stick. And the farmer saying, well, I don't like this end. So we say, well, all right, we have to together construct a new food system that says the first responsibility of the farmer is to feed the family. First of all, if you can't feed yourself, what kind of farmer are you? I mean, that is, if there's nothing left on the, at the end of the day for your family, who cares how much you exported? That's a very, very silly game. So we sort of say, well, maybe we should just really focus on sustainable communities, and we feed the family in our community. And if we've got something left over, fine, I'll happily trade it for something that I can't produce. But we have our priorities quite straight, and that food is of such importance, and everything that goes with it in terms of independence, and good health, and so on. That we have to have a different set of criteria for how we approach food, and say, no, this is not just an optional commodity that we'll go around and buy wherever we can at the lowest cost, because that's what's produced the situation. We have to say, no, this is important. My health is important. My kids are important. The land is important. My community is important. And therefore, I'm quite happy to pay a fair price, because I want my neighbor down the road. I don't want to see a vacant lot there because he couldn't afford to farm anymore on that land. So we keep it here and restructure everything. And I think that's where we are. And it's in one sense can be a very daunting prospect to say you've got to recreate all this stuff. Well, no, you don't have to recreate all that stuff. That's what we want to get away from. Much more satisfying to be dealing with your neighbors and your friends and saying, how do we look after each other at that level with the best possible food that we can grow, and if we're going to drink our coffee, well, we're still addicted to that. I enjoy my coffee, okay, but I know other people now, I'm quite happy to pay way more than what I could get it for in the supermarket. Not only because the quality is going to be a whole lot better, but I'd like to buy fair traded coffee grown by small farmers that are looking after their ecology. And it's going to cost. Okay, so it costs. I'm happy to pay it. And I'll do without some other stuff. And I think we can reorganize our priorities when we get that clear about what we're up to in radical ways. And then you just don't need all those middlemen and all that stuff that's in there and all that packaging. And you can go and get stuff and keep it. And we'll go back to having community freezers, cold storage places, cold cellars, and so on. And even in the north, people saying, we've forgotten, people here used to feed themselves. We can grow all kinds of food way up north. People don't believe it anymore. They don't even know how. And we're going to rediscover that.
If they can't grow it now, they will be with global warming.
Well, yeah, but they could do it now. Somebody started me the other day, said, sure, we only have 90 frost-free days. But for part of that 90 days, we have sun 24 hours a day, and you should see the way things grow. And it just never occurred to me. I'm a northerner. I bet I never had thought about that far north and what happens. And it's very startling when you say, oh my goodness, my assumptions are totally wrong, inadequate.
Cargill in the past, and they've been around for how long?
165 years.
They've been able to exercise some muscle in the early days. The railroads were even involved, as I understand it, because that was the main method of transportation.
Yeah.
So how was Cargill able to control farmers in the early days in concert with the transportation system?
Well, there's a wonderful book called about Chicago, and it's just a history of the development of this nature's metropolis. It's a wonderful story. It talks about the whole development of the grain trade, where initially, you'd come to town with your wagon load of grain, and I as a buyer would buy it, and I'd look at it and say, okay, I'll give you this much for it. And then they wanted to move a little bit further, and wanted a bigger lot, and some guy was in New York, and he wanted so much grain, or some guy in London wanted it. So they had to get some standards, and so that when you bought a bag of grain, I could tell you it was this quality over the telephone or by whatever message. And somebody could say, okay, I want so many tons of grain of this quality, and you had these standards that would do it. But the minute that relationship was broken between buyer and seller, then you had some guy would step in, and if it was a shrewd grain dealer, and he'd see a farmer would come to town, and he knew he was short of cash, and he'd say, hey, I'll give you so much for this right here. You don't have to go anywhere else. And the farmer would accept it, and the guy might know that he had a market for that grain in New York, and by being ready to pay that cash up front to that farmer and get that, he could make 10%, 50% on that shipment of grain, because he knew what his costs were going to be. And it just go from that point on of taking a little bit along the way, and the more you handle that, then if that guy ends up as Cargill did, he start buying and selling grain, and then pretty soon you're having the elevator, and pretty soon you've got the flour mill, and pretty soon you've got the salt fat plant, and then you've got all the pieces of it, and you keep accumulating it that way until the food, as it goes through the system, you're taking a little bit off all the way along. You get not only control, but you're making money out of every step of the food system. And that's how those companies have gotten to that point. I mean, apart from government assistance and a lot of other things, but it's that intervention, and that's why I think you said we come back to the question of people now saying, all right, we really don't need those people in most cases. If we didn't insist on importing and exporting and so on, we could eliminate an awful lot of that, and think of the wealth that would leave in the community if we were self-sufficient. It doesn't mean a lower standard of living. It'd probably be a much better one. But it wouldn't look as good on paper, because you wouldn't see the GNP would be shrinking, because there wouldn't be so much buying and selling and profiteering. But that doesn't say anything about the quality of life that people would have.
Have the farmers ever tried to put their foot down, their feet, collectively against forces like Cargill?
Well, that was the Canadian Wheat Board is a direct result of that. When in the 20s and 30s, and it didn't really come to fruition until after the war, but the Wheat Board and the other marketing boards in Canada that came in the 60s were all put there to give farmers, to even the odds, as it were, a bit, by saying, okay, in the case of the Canadian Wheat Board, which the U.S. and the grain traders have been determined to get rid of for years, and Cargill being one of the lead players to try and break it down, but what they said was that the Wheat Board will buy all the grain that is grown on the prairies at an equitable price for everybody. It doesn't matter where you live. You'll get the same price for the same quality of grain on a certain schedule, so that everybody had a fair crack at it, because they realized when you had only 6 buyers, 200,000 farmers they didn't stand a chance individually. The only way they stood a chance of getting a fair price from the 6 buyers was if they did it collectively. And of course, the grain companies didn't like that, because they could no longer play one farmer off against another. They had to deal with an agency which was representing the well-being of them all. So it's still a battle today going on to try and destroy the Wheat Board so that the companies can exploit the farmers fully. And they've been chipping away at it little by little. About the same thing with milk marketing boards, egg boards, and so on, that have again, acted as single desk selling agencies in order to protect the farmers, recognizing that the farmer really can do a better job milking the cows and delivering the milk than trying to also be the delivery man and then deal with the consolidation in the industry, which they can't deal with. I mean, it's just too big. The U.S. doesn't have that same tradition. What you've got are interesting ones like the cotton growers, who have a cartel as cotton growers, but they represent mega business. They're not the small farmers. They're not operating interest of all the farmers. It's just a controlling cartel. Sugar's another one in the U.S. It's where people say, "Oh no, we're much better off if we stick together." But it's a very different. But there's no notion of social justice in that kind of marketing structure.
There was also some talk during this conference about the effective or purpose or design of biotechnology as it may be applied to organic farming. Some of the organic farmers believe that they do pose a threat to conventional agriculture, and that the emergence of biotechnology may be designed to simply put them out of business somehow. And I'm wondering if you've touched on that at all in your writings.
Well, I listened to industry people a couple of days ago at a conference and going on about how environmentally friendly genetically engineered food will be, and look, we can do away with herbicides and we can do this and that, and it really is tiresome because it's just one big lie. What biotechnology is about, I think, is very simple. I mean, the easiest way to understand it is to go back to the development of hybrid corn in the 1930s and discover that if you hybridize with and produce an F1 cross out of inbred parents, you've produced a plant which the first generation will be what you're after, and the second will be so unstable that you don't know what you're going to get. So the farmers, since it had to go back to the supplier every year for new seed, you couldn't save your seed anymore. And that was the beginning. And biotechnology, in a sense, in terms of the way it's being developed, has been developed, is to extend that kind of control. It doesn't have anything to do with feeding the hungry of the world or improving nutrition or saving the environment. It has to do with how you can restructure food for corporate profit so that you have control over that and force the farmer to go back for seed, force the farmer into a situation of utter dependency. Monsanto does this with patented seed and then technology use agreements and so on, where farmer signs that they will not do anything the company doesn't permit them to do, and it becomes legally indebted to that company. And that is, again, that's simply a matter of control, so that Monsanto can maximize its profits, or any number of now 5 other companies. That's all we're talking about, with something like 80% of the global seed supply in their hands. Control. From beginning, and I think we need to be, one needs to be just very, very blunt about it. That's what this game is about. They want control. The tighter that control can be, the fewer police. I mean, it doesn't look good to send the sheriff out to get somebody. So if you can structure that right into that kind of control right into the seed, you don't need police anymore. People have no choice. It's right there. You've just hidden it in the seed. There you are. Well, that's why we're faced with, people realizing all of a sudden, all the way across the food chain, it's quite amazing. People are realizing, beginning to sense what's going on and saying, that whole project gives me indigestion. It is not good for me. I don't think I want to eat that stuff.
Brewster, thank you very much.
It's the most exotic and revered predator on Earth. The tiger needs no introduction, but soon it may need an epitaph. A deadly trade is close to wiping out the species. It's a race against time. But conservationist Anthony Marr is convinced that the Bengal tiger still has a chance before the world waves goodbye to the last wild tigers. The dawn sun creeps through the mist at Bandhavgarh National Park. This is India's forest heartland, timeless and untouched. For centuries, this exquisite setting was the hunting preserve of the Maharaja of Rewa. Now it's a safe haven for India's rich wildlife. But this is the animal that Anthony Marr has come to see.
It just gets right into the core of my soul. There is no adjective that is adequate to describe its beauty, its magnificence. It's just the most beautiful animal on earth that I have ever seen. When I see a tiger in the forest, it's a magical feeling. Merely knowing that it exists without even seeing it is a magical feeling, and I know that if the tiger is gone from this land will have lost its soul.
It was 7 million years ago that the tigers of the world originated in what is now Manchuria in the northeast of China. This was the dominant predator that feared no other animal. A solitary beast, chiefly nocturnal, that kept to itself, a little like our domestic cats, and just as likely to keep the neighbors cursing their feline turf wars. Anthony Marr is no stranger to Bandhavgarh National Park. It's one of the success stories in tiger conservation in India, and he's come back here to find out for himself how the tiger population is faring in a very hostile world. But seeing tigers here is no foregone conclusion. They've over 400 square miles of wooded territory to hide in. Of course, on the roads they leave their telltale tracks, the pug marks that tell you who passed by and when. No one blames you for looking over your shoulder.
And how fresh it is?
In the morning.
In the morning?
About 7 o'clock.
About 7 o'clock, so it's about 5 hours from now.
Yeah.
Can you identify this tiger?
Yes.
The name of this tiger is Bada Bacha, big baby.
Barabacha.
Barabacha. It is a cub of Sita.
A cub of Sita. Oh,
Cub
I
of
see.
Sita.
I see.
It is a very heavy tiger.
This is Charger, Brabaricha's dad, and no lightweight himself. The most famous of the Bandhavgarh tigers, who got his name scaring the wits out of tourists by charging at their elephants. There's around a 1 in 3 chance of a tiger sighting on any particular outing, but the park biologists pool their findings, and the patterns of behavior of the different animals can be guessed at. Charger's mate Sita has produced 18 cubs over the last 11 years, yet just 7 made it to adulthood. A high mortality rate that concerns Anthony Marr when he considers the future for the species. In all, Bandhavgarh is home to perhaps 40 tigers, but no one knows for sure. Marking their territories like a cat with urine and tree scratching, male tigers will patrol up to 50 square miles of forest, giving other males a wide berth. The females are interested in a territory only for prey and to protect her cubs, often within or straddling a male's domain. However, his main concern is a territory that holds a large harem of females for breeding. It's not possible to think of India without thinking of tigers. At the turn of the century, there were upwards of 100,000 tigers across the whole of India, for the British Raj and their Indian cohorts to turn into a national blood sport. Grandiose killing parties gave visiting kings and courtiers the bloody chance to bag a skin for the living room floor. It was all good fun.
Trophy hunting was the first scourge of the tiger. One Maharaja chalked up about 3,000 plus tigers, all killed by himself. And that is amazing, because if you count all the tigers in India today, there is not 3,000.
When the British left, tiger numbers still stood at 30,000. But 20 years later, in the late 60s, a national census recorded a knife-edge national population of only 1,800 animals. In a state of alarm, Indian conservationists convinced the Prime Minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, that the tiger was in real danger of extinction. She responded by placing a total ban on trophy hunting, forcing state governments to afford tigers protection, and in 1972, she set up Project Tiger with a clear aim of turning the tide. Mrs. Gandhi's Project Tiger got underway, and central to the plan was the creation of new tiger reserves. Now the tiny tiger population could settle down in peace and with some security get on with what the world expected of them. Tiger nature being what it is, we were not to be disappointed. Project Tiger was an undoubted success. Within 10 years, the population almost doubled and the world breathed a sigh of relief. Yet the dice are still loaded against these little kittens. Tigers are born blind and helpless in a well-hidden den, and their eyes don't open until their second week of life. The mother's alone with no mate to help her. And when she has to leave the den to hunt, the cubs are at the mercy of every passing jackal, wild dog, or python. Even another tiger might make a quick snack out of them. So it's good going for a wild tigress to raise more than one cub to maturity every year. And yet, for those that do survive to adulthood, the hope for continued survival and success for the species will ultimately depend on a well-stocked forest larder. Tigers can make 10 or more attempts before being rewarded with a kill. Patience and tenacity are their virtues that ensure them a full stomach. average, a tiger will make a kill once every 3 days. But if they've no success in 10 days, chances are they'll be too weak to hunt and die. Survival of the fittest seems like a cruel extra hurdle when it's a whole species fighting for its life. Tigers will eat 70 pounds of meat at one sitting. They have voracious appetites, and with a family, this deer carcass could disappear almost overnight. When the tiger reserves were established, many villagers were evicted from their homes and resettled without compensation in new farming areas just outside the park. Here they continue to scratch a living from the soil, often with an understandable deep-seated resentment of the tigers and the conservation movement. And that can translate into a perilous situation.
There were 3 or 4 main threats. Number one is habitat destruction, which is rampant by the rural people themselves, not out of maliciousness or anything. They just have to eke out a living. Number 2 is poaching. Poaching has replaced trophy hunting as a big threat to the tiger, direct killing. Number 3, village people have been poisoning tigers for taking their cattle. There are 600 million sacred cattle in India versus about 2,500 tigers. And a lot of village people are poisoning tigers for taking one cow. And this is a phenomenon that is going on all over the country.
Outside Bandhavgarh, this old man tells stories of tigers coming out of the park, killing his livestock, and not getting the proper compensation. He's not surprised that villagers have been leaving poisoned meat. Too many people, too many cows, too little land, and a magnificent animal, the tiger, not welcome and in trouble. Bandhavgarh, it's summer and it's siesta time. When you look at tigers, you can't help comparing their behavior with your domestic cat. As long as they're well fed, they'll snooze contentedly all day long. The afternoon temperatures can be well over 110 in the shade, and sometimes that's just too much even for a tiger to take. At the edge of the park, it's wash and brush up time for the other residents. In the noonday sun, elephants join the mad dogs and Englishmen. It's one of the perks of the job, a midday massage to ease the old bones before you get another giddy round of carting eager tourists round on your back. Assessing the health of tiger populations is not easy. In years gone by, the authorities overestimated tiger numbers to make their conservation efforts look more successful than they really were. The biggest stumbling block to tiger numbers is lack of good habitat. Tigers need space, and they don't like to share. When numbers do increase, they need a stable food supply and room to roam. When the family splits up, the heat is on for each of the cubs out on their own to establish a new territory. That's tough in a land where the forest is shrinking daily. And that is only the start of the tiger's problems. Ever present is the threat of death at the hands of poachers.
The poachers themselves are mostly Indian village people. They were given about $50 a bottle of whiskey. They'll do it for anything.
Based on police seizures of the dead animals, the official death toll is almost certainly underestimated. But probably for the whole country, somewhere around 700 animals every year end up as part of this grim and sinister trade. These poachers have made hundreds of thousands of dollars slaughtering and selling tigers. An often corrupt justice system and tiny fines only makes things worse, much worse. In the biggest ever haul of poachers' contraband, the Delhi police inspect this fortune in tiger skins and sackloads of bones bound for China.
So the 1990s was a desperate decade for the tiger, and that is due to poaching, to supply the Oriental communities around the world with tiger bones medicine, tiger penis medicine. The Chinese believes that the more powerful and the more spirited an animal is, then the better medicine it's going to make, because the Chinese believes that if you ingest the body part of a powerful animal, then the power can be transferred into your body. It is all due to the Chinese consumption of tiger parts that these magnificent beasts are going down. I end up very embarrassed and sometimes extremely disgusted. So at one point I said to one of my friends, I said, somebody's got to do it. Somebody has got to stop this Chinese tradition, and I believe it has to be a Chinese person. The Chinese do revere the tiger. In fact, they are revering it to death. Of the 12 animals on the Chinese zodiac, it is the dragon first and the tiger second. But of course the dragon is mythical, the tiger is real. But the tiger is going to become mythical pretty soon. Basically, Chinese culture is trying to wipe out the tiger, which took 10 million years to evolve. And who are we human beings with an evolutionary history of less than 500,000 years to step in and within 50, 60 years wipe out something that took so long for Mother Nature to achieve?
Across the Himalayan mountains in China, demand for traditional medicines ensures that each dead tiger smuggled here is worth $100,000. There's a newfound affluence in China, and that means that without considerable help, the world's 4,000 remaining tigers don't stand much of a chance.
Within China, they're just going to keep on consuming because they just wanted an extra dose of fortification for their failing health or whatever. They don't know how dire the situation is. Maybe they don't care. What is worse, ignorance or apathy? That's the problem that the entire world has to deal with.
Fortunately, neither ignorance nor apathy are acceptable to Anthony Marr, and rallying willing troops to the cause is a full-time occupation.
The distinguishing feature of this event from any other tiger conservation project anywhere in the world is that this is focused upon kids. We believe that the only thing that hasn't been done so far to save the tiger is to involve children. And I feel that if we can raise the passion of the children for the tiger around the world, I believe that there is a very good chance that the tiger can be saved.
The Western world loves a good cause. When you're well-fed, well-housed and reasonably clothed, it's easy to take the pledge and salve your conscience with some spare change. But the real battleground lies somewhere else, a world away from the bright lights of North America. 1,000 million Indian people, excruciatingly poor and increasingly desperate, are the ones who ultimately will decide the tiger's fate. And they have a lot on their minds. perhaps Anthony Marr has got it right. The idealism and uncluttered outlook of kids is fertile territory.
Since these kids have tigers as neighbors, and since the tigers are being killed quickly, we need their help to save the tiger.
कि जो टाइगर की जो बोन्स और जो हड्डियां वगैरह जो लोग खाने के
The passion of the children is absolutely vital to the project. And I see it everywhere. I've been to more than 100 schools. I've spoken to 31,000 children in the last 12 months. Overwhelming majority of the children say they love the tiger, and that if I could show them what they could do to help save the tiger, they would help out. Any kid who wants to save the tiger, raise their hands. That's great. There is no other persuasive force more powerful than children's voices.
In time, so the theory goes, powerful voices will change the world. But meanwhile, the 40 tigers of Bandhavgarh don't have the luxury of time to spare. What these animals desperately need is a completely safe haven. National parks have often been targeted by poaching gangs looking for easy tiger pickings. Security is still the #1 priority for the conservationists.
The most important is to enlist the help of the people who actually live in Tigerland. Because they, first of all, are the poachers, they are the woodcutters, they are the cattle grazers.
And to this end, Anthony Marr and international aid programs are showing that there could be a local payoff from tiger conservation. There is money for medical clinics and doctors, and there are some encouraging signs that the Indian villagers are responding. Slowly, the rural population is coming to understand that tigers are worth more alive than dead. Once they came to hunt the tiger to death. Now both Indians and foreigners come to see the living. With ecotourism, there is a growing awareness that might just pay the ultimate dividend. A secure and growing wild population. The 1970s was the era of Save the Whales, when a global rallying call galvanized the world into action. Now it's high noon for the tigers. The world of the 90s needs a repeat performance. And one thing is for certain, if we can't save this animal while there's still time, future generations will look back and shake their heads in disbelief.